10 to 1 in favor. That carries. Councillor Carter.
Once again, Mr. Mayor, this relates to the same report, section 5.6. I do have a motion, and I have copies here for the clerk. I'd like to have a recorded vote once this comes to the time for a vote. Mr. Mayor, if you don't mind, please. A request
at the appropriate time, as always.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. So this refers to 5.6. It is page 5 of CM-1736, whereas approved capital projects may experience surpluses or overruns due to unavoidable circumstances throughout the year, approved capital, and whereas these situations require staff to assess the conditions of the project, which may require a report to council, which could cause delays and additional costs, and whereas should the project need funding which may already be available in the approved capital budget via a surplus in another project, and whereas in order to provide flexibility to adopt for these circumstances, it was recommended through report CM-17-36 titled 2018 Capital Budget that capital priorities be adjusted by staff as appropriate within the approved annual capital budget funding envelope. Therefore, be it resolved that the city manager, in consultation with the treasurer, be granted the authority to adjust the capital priorities as appropriate should unforeseen situations arise, so long as the adjustments are within the existing approved budget. Funding requirements that exceed the total approved capital budget would be reported to council for consideration. This is just to make the process, Mr. Mayor, a lot more smooth. We're always looking at ways of efficiencies, making sure that we follow, of course, our procedures and policies. But when it comes to making sure that we're able to be as efficient as possible, this is just a piece of the puzzle that helps us be able to accomplish that. Of course, as you saw in the last line there, funding requirements that exceed the total approved capital budget would be reported to council for consideration. So that kind of clarifies it to make sure that it still comes back to council. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I'll support this. I think one of the things that look back, always good to look at the past to see where you're going in the future, but when we look back, when things like this have happened in the past, we are sometimes scurrying to find time and availability of staff and members of council to hold a special meeting, whether it be one of the committees and then a council meeting in order to, because it becomes very time sensitive, in order to make sure that the work continues and that the project goes and stays on time. And I think this is very ideal situation. Then we won't have to scurry around at the last minute and do a lot of time sensitive stuff. The city manager, the professional that he is, will make sure that the parameters of the intent of this are kept. And of course the treasurer, our ever careful watchdog on our finances, will make sure that the financial side of it is done. So I support this motion. I believe it's a good motion. Thank you.
Councilor McQuaid-England.
Yes, just in terms of this, for the funding requirements that exceed the total approved capital budget that would be reported to council for consideration, those funding requirements would need 2/3 as they were outside of the original capital budget approval.
So it would take 2/3 if it's a variance from the council, yes. Of the approval that was already passed, right?
Okay, so it says here that where in order to provide flexibility to adapt for these circumstances, it's recommended through CM 1736 titled 2018 Capital Budget, that capital priorities be adjusted by staff as appropriate within the approved annual capital budget funding envelope. So does that mean that if capital project A comes under budget by $100,000, that means that that can be then moved to another project prior to coming to council? And that the only time it comes back to council, like, I'm just trying to understand the process of how this works.
Ms. Sinnott?
Through you, Mayor Henry, if Project A comes in under budget for $100,000, but Project B comes in over $100,000, then the intent of this motion is to apply the savings from Project A to the overage in Project B without having to come back to council.
And when would those when would that financial information be reported to council? At what point? So that we can take, so that council would be able to track projects that are over budget or projects that are under budget.
Sinnott?
Through you, Mayor Henry, that information would be reported back to council via the annual financial statements.
So not throughout the year, and they will not actually be for council consideration because the financial statements have already been, that's end of year financial statements. Am I correct? So those decisions have already been made. So it's not like council can say, we didn't agree with you applying that Project A savings to Project B overrun.
That's correct. The annual financial statements are a year-end document, and those decisions would have already been made, and that's the intent of the motion.
And at what point so council only receives the information at end of year in terms of cost overruns from projects, and is there anything that we need to do in terms of the delegation of authority related to the amount that staff members can allocate money without council approval based on this motion? Because I do believe that this would affect the delegation of authority bylaw in terms of when staff must report back to council based on the number amount.
Sinnott?
It's my understanding that there would be an adjustment required to the delegation of authority bylaw to accommodate this motion.
And the adjustment to the delegation of authority bylaw would be not by a dollar amount, because we would not know the exact amount of a cost overrun or a cost coming under budget. It would just give blanket approval for staff in order to be able to accomplish this task.
Sinnott?
That is correct. The dollars are already within the approved budget, so it would not be anything additional to the budget. So that's correct.
And council will not receive, just so that I'm clear, for instance, let's say Fire Station 6 was over budget. Typically in the past, or any project, we would get an update on the extent of why it's over budget, and then we would help staff make the decision on this. That won't be happening now, based on this?
Ms. Sinnott?
Through you, Mayor Henry, that's not necessarily the case. If the, as you indicated, Fire Hall 6, if Fire Hall 6 was over budget and it was outside of the approved capital budget, the budget already approved by council, then we would need to report back on that overage, the reasons why the overage was, and propose some funding towards it. If it was a minor overage that we had some savings from another capital projects, we would redirect the dollars from the savings back to cover off the overage.
And when you say minor adjustments, what would you consider in terms of the amount of money in terms of a minor adjustment?
So the minor adjustment, meaning anything that's within the approved capital budget, I would suspect that our capital estimates on our project budgets are very good. So any surpluses or overages would be relatively small in nature, and anything that was large in nature would most likely be outside of the approved capital budget envelope.
Unless a series of projects came under budget with small amounts adding up to a larger amount and then could be applied to an overage that has a large amount.
That could be a possibility.
And in terms of the delegation of authority bylaw, Mr. Mayor, it's not mentioned in this. When will that adjustment to the delegation of the authority bylaw be coming back for approval?
Ms. Senate?
It could come back whenever council would like it to come back.
Under the delegation of authority bylaw as it sits right now, what is the process when there's a cost overrun on a project?
Through you, Mayor Henry, it's not currently addressed in the delegation of authority bylaw.
What is currently addressed is the amount of money that staff can make a decision on. So what is, for instance, the max amount of money that a department or can make a decision without having to report back to council?
Through you, Mayor Henry, we can only make decisions based on the approved budget.
And this motion here would change that, right? This motion would say that regardless of the approved budget, council, is there a mechanism for council to get updated either quarterly or otherwise on projects that have cost overruns and how that money has been reallocated?
Ms. Senate?
Through you, Mayor Henry, that's actually contrary to the intent of the motion. The intent is to improve the efficiency of the staff to be able to deal with operational needs within the approved capital budget.
Where does this provide transparency to the public in terms of being able to follow projects and understand cost overruns? If we delegate this authority to staff and we're not given any update until after all of the decisions have been made, where is the transparency to the citizens in terms of how their money is being spent and what projects have come over in terms of cost overruns?
Senate?
Through you, Mayor Henry, the transparency element is addressed through the approval of the capital budget.
But it's not addressed in the approval of the capital budget because I don't know what projects might come under budget and what projects might have cost overruns, and neither does the public. That's not contemplated within this capital budget. Is that correct?
At this point in time, the capital budget is the staff's best estimate of the project budget for each and every project. So staff have put their best estimate forward and believe that those projects will come in within that approved budget.
If staff believe that those projects will come in with those approved budgets, then why would we need to move this motion?
Through you, Mayor Henry, because there are unforeseen circumstances that do arise from time to time, which could change the scope of the budget required for a project. And if it can be accommodated through the surplus of another project, then that would give staff the ability to continue executing the capital project without having to come back to council.
Could you give an example of any project last year where there was a cost overrun that had to come back to council, where there was an issue because of the time sensitivity?
Through you, Mayor Henry, there are a series of projects over the last 2 years that have had to go through committee and council related to some fleet vehicles and some building requirements. the time delays that can be associated with the reporting process back can also lead to increased costs and project schedule delays.
Would you be able to give an example of when a project that had a cost overrun that had to go through the council committee process actually ended up costing more money? And how much more money did that project cost?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Would you be able to give an example in the previous year where because of the structure of going through committee and council for the approval of the cost overrun actually ended up costing us more money than originally planned?
Through you, Mayor Henry, I don't have that information with me, but I can provide an example of where that could happen. So some of the projects that came back to committee and council did relate to the ordering of fleet vehicles that required additional funding. In the case of vehicles, we have a specific window within which we need to order them from the manufacturer to be able to keep the pricing stable. If we miss that order window, then the prices will increase.
And what would the approximate increase be?
That would be not easy to estimate.
No, I think it would be, would it not?
No.
If we're not within the contract, we know that it would cost X number of dollars past that contract.
Sometimes if the product comes from the United States, it's a variance in the dollar. It's hard to contemplate that increase.
Can there be included a budget cap in terms of this? So let's say cost overruns under $50,000 would not need to come back to council, but cost overruns over $50,000 must come back to council?
Ms. Sinnott?
Through you, Mayor Henry, we would adjust the delegation of authority bylaw by whatever council would desire.
But this motion would cause the bylaw to be, the housekeeping related to the bylaw would have to happen.
Through you, Mayor Henry, the bylaw would need to be amended from this motion, or if there was a cap, that would also have to be an amendment to the delegation of authority bylaw.
So just so that I'm clear, under the current delegation of authority bylaw, any cost overrun for a particular project must come back to council regardless of the amount?
It's my understanding that there is no established practice in the delegation of authority bylaw at this time.
So where does that fall under? Under what current policy of the city does it fall under that staff must report back to council in terms of cost overruns for projects?
There is no current policy. That's what this motion is trying to do, is trying to formalize a process whereby which it will increase the efficiency and flexibility of staff to be able to execute capital projects.
Mr. Mayor, at this time, I appreciate the mover of the motion bringing this forward, but this does nothing in terms of transparency for the public, and it does nothing in terms of ensuring that council are aware of what projects have cost overruns and what projects are coming in under budget and how to ensure that that money is spent accordingly. I think it's relatively important for staff to report back to council when a project has a cost overrun. If that cost overrun, let's say, is...
Councilor England, you have the floor, please.
Oh, no,
continue.
I was just waiting until conversation ended. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If the cost overrun is $100,000, $150,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, we wouldn't have any way of being reported back to that. And we're responsible for the money that is being spent here on behalf of the citizens. I think it's relatively important not only to track cost overruns by project, but also to track cost overruns by department to start looking at which departments tend to come in yearly with cost overruns and which departments tend to come yearly with cost under the original amount. I don't think that this is, while I appreciate and trust that staff can do this, this is not a way for us to manage financial prudency for the public. It does not allow us to know when projects are over budget and the reason in which these projects are over budget. And it also basically gives blanket authority for staff to rearrange the budget as long as it's within the approved budget line, which is not the practice of this council and has not been the practice of this council for a very long time. So if we have issues in terms of time sensitivity projects, well then council needs to ensure that they're available for special council meetings to deal with these items. You only need 24-hour notice in order to hold a meeting. You need a minimum quorum of 6 people, and at least then we understand what projects are coming over budget. I mean, to give blanket approval to staff to do this really leaves the public in the dark, and it also leaves council in the dark in terms of where we should be monitoring and watching for cost overruns. The cost overruns are what cause the city problems. And I would suggest that things like the Works Depot or building of fire stations or other very important issues that have had controversy surrounding them, the public would not be very accepting to not knowing that there are cost overruns to those projects that weren't reported until the end of the year and that had never been reported back to council or approved by council. I don't think that this is an appropriate financial or prudent step forward, and I think that this will actually decrease the amount of transparency and make it harder for the public to stay engaged in these projects. So I will not be voting for this.
Quick question, clarification, Ms. Senator, on accounting practices.
Thank you for the question, Mayor Henry. We currently do provide reporting back to council on a quarterly basis. We currently report on the operational operating budget primarily to let council know how we are tracking to budget. We could look to expand that report that we currently do to outline projects that might be over budget.
Councilor Pidwerbecki.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm sorry, I don't interpret it the same way. I think if you look at the very bottom paragraph of this, and I think it was brought forward by the Councilor Carter, that therefore be resolved, the city manager in consultation with the treasurer be granted the authority to adjust capital priorities as appropriate should unforeseen situations arise, so long as the adjustments are within the existing approved budget, which means they're not going to be able to knock the cap off of the budget and just move money around it nilly-willy. If there is an extreme amount of money that's excessive and they need to move money from one project to another, if that is available to them, then they must come forward to the council. That's the way I read this. Funding requirements that exceed the total approval capital budget would be reported to the council for consideration. So I think we are covered as councillors. I think the taxpayers will be knowledgeable if there are major changes in the budget. All this is saying is if you are within the budget and there is money that we can move from one area to another in what we can call a sensitive area to keep the project going without cost escalations, that should be done. So I think this is self-explanatory. We spent about a half an hour on just kicking this around saying there's no transparency. I think it's as transparent as possible. So I'm going to certainly be supporting this. Thank you.
Councilor Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too think there are a couple of pieces missing from this. And I agree in principle, but either there should be an amount that needs a ceiling that needs to be adjusted or moved over, under which staff can go ahead, over which we should be informed, And the other piece is the communication channel. I don't feel comfortable that we only hear about it at the end of the year. I think something like this can be reported either on a as-needs basis or certainly on a quarterly basis. I don't see anything wrong with that, but I like the principle of the staff being able to say, it's just like running a household budget. You know, you budget so much money for the roof to get done, and it comes in over, and then all of a sudden you got something else that happens at the house you didn't foresee, and now you got the money to do it. I get that, but we're a city council responsible to taxpayers. And I think we need to have a reporting mechanism, a communication mechanism more frequently than a year. And I just think we should be apprised of amounts. And that's all I would like to see in this. Otherwise, I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. Clarification from the treasurer again. You talked about reporting times. Could you explain that again, please?
The quarterly reporting.
Yes, please.
Currently, we report back to council on a quarterly basis. It goes through committee and council on our financial results, which at current really speaks to the operating budget and where we're tracking to budget, whether we are tracking over budget or under budget, the reasons for those underages and overages. We could look to expand that report to explain any project overages as well.
Would that include capital projects? Thank you. I think that would do it. I would just like to see something quarterly as opposed to at the end of the year. Thank you.
Councillor John Neal,
Yeah, are we speaking to this item now?
speaking to this item. Yes.
Okay. I think there's more to this than what we see here. There could be liability issues in buildings in which legal have to, would probably be advised, I would think, through the KPMG of the city's asset management guides that they just did, that like that has to be in there in regards to what our assets are and reporting to council. So there are no shortcuts in this. If there's overages, if there's underspending, fine, Danny. If there's flexibility, let staff management, as long as they report to council. And if that's a waste of time, then that's your opinion of the matter. It's not mine. But if it's liability in buildings and there's money being transferred around from projects, then council is responsible in the end. And if it winds up in court, this council is in court paying for our legal department to catch up and then report to council, which is, as far as I'm concerned, late. And we've experienced that with the Legend Center roof. We've experienced that with the South Oshawa roof. Children's Arena roof, at one time there was a report, didn't come back to council soon enough, and it got worse. And then I was told, well, we didn't bring it back to council. We thought we could fix it. And then in the end, of course, this is years ago, and a lot of you weren't here.
Councillor Neal, you're getting a little bit off topic, so
No, well, not really.
stay to the
I'm not getting off topic at all, because I've sat in a lot of meetings hearing what should have been brought back, and it wasn't. And this is what this is speaking to today. And another issue in regards to the whole thought of not knowing when you go into a building and seeing some work being done, then you're asking staff, and then you're going back and having to an explanation in regards to that. So it just doesn't make sense.
Okay. Councillor, we're still on the first time around, so I have to come back to you, Councillor Pidwerbecki. Councillor Shields?
Call the question if I could. Would I be in order?
No, and I'm going to check that as a procedural
I can call
issue.
a question
Can you call a
at any
question?
time.
Can you call a question in committee of the whole? No limitation. I'm still going to go to Councillor Shields first.
Thank you, Mayor Henry. My concerns regarding this are similar to what Councilor Kerr had mentioned, the reporting aspect of this and a cap. I think the reporting aspect can be addressed through the quarterly reports, as mentioned. My concern is regarding a cap, as in, I think this is great for shuffling around small amounts. One thing's over a little bit, one thing's under. But if something is over, every item has different scales, so I'm not going to use a dollar amount as an example, but, you know, if it's a certain percentage over and it doesn't come through council because there was enough money made up on things that come under, that doesn't provide us with the transparency that we need. So I think the intention is good the way it is, but if we could provide some sort of a cap, whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage over budget to incorporate into this, that would make me more comfortable. Thank you.
Councilor Pidwerbecki.
To call the question.
Question has been called. Question is in order. Record a vote on the item.
Mr. Mayor, there was questions asked by a previous council member and by actually two previous council members in terms of concerns.
Councilor McQuaid, I've already called for the vote. He's called the question. I'm calling the vote.
So to be clear, I'd like to challenge the call for the vote.
Well, first of all, we're going to take the vote on call the question, and then we're going to take. So we'll see where it goes.
I'd like to speak on the call for the question. I'm allowed to speak to that?
There's no debate, Councilor McQuaid-England, on calling the question. It's a vote. And if you want to record a vote, you have the option of asking for it as we call the question. Would you like to record a vote?
I would.
Thank you.
I'm
Record a
not
vote
quite
called by
sure
Councilor
why
McQuaid.
I'm getting such hostility from members of council for simply trying to do my job.
Councilor McQuaid-England, I'm sorry that if you feel that that's happening.
No, this isn't how I feel. This is how it's projected to the public, Mr. Mayor.
I'm calling the vote, please, on the question.
Councilor McQuaid-England?
No.
Councilor Neal?
No.
Councilor Pidwerbecki?
Yes.
Councilor Sanders?
No.
Councilor Shields?
No.
Councilor Aker?
Yes.
Councilor Bates?
No.
Councilor Carter?
Yes.
Councilor Chapman?
Yes.
Mayor Henry?
Yes.
Councilor Kerr?
No.
6. The motion to call the question has lost 5-6.
Okay. Councilor McQuaid-England.
I'm quite concerned at the way this is going today. Sorry, just wanted to make sure that I wasn't receiving any sort of attitude from one of my council colleagues.
Please speak to the motion, please. That's what's on
Well,
the floor.
it's actually, Mr. Mayor, it's very hard to speak to the motion when you're receiving offhanded comments and side conversations, and it seems to me if I was to be doing the same thing, I would be called out for it.
Well, actually, just to be fair, if that is the issue that you're seeing, then be very careful. If any member of council leans over to talk to another member of council for the length of this meeting, because I will call you on that. So,
well, I always get called on it. I just don't see it being called on other people.
So I haven't called anybody on it today, but I will be more diligent. Councilor England, you have the floor, so please.
I hope it will be fairly.
Councilor England, please speak to the motion.
I have a few concerns. Concern number one is this motion pretty much renders council. What's the point in us? What's the point in us being council members and being elected in order to make these decisions if we're constantly delegating this to staff? If we want staff to run the city and we want to be hands-off, then don't run for council again, because your job is to ensure that money is spent accordingly and that we track the money. This doesn't allow us to do that. There was concerns raised by Councilor Kerr and by Councilor Shields in terms of the reporting process. I would suggest that those concerns raised by those councillors be added as amendments to ensure that it's dealt with today, that you don't have this go through and then you leave that for another day, because it will probably be lost and you will lose the opportunity to get that reporting structure that you like, because it's not included in this budgetary item. And I think that there should be a cap. I want to know if a cost for a project runs over by $250,000 for unforeseen circumstances. I want to know what those unforeseen circumstances are, why the cost overrun happened, and what we can do to ensure that it doesn't happen in the future. If we're not being reported on this until the end of the year and staff can just adjust accordingly within the budget, there is no transparency. This, to me, such a dangerous precedent. Our job is to manage the budget. This is the budget process. And by doing this, you are giving up your elected authority in order to represent your constituents on financial matters. So I would be very wary of council members agreeing to this and giving this much authority to staff. I understand that staff are professional. I understand that staff do their job in the most effective ways possible, but there are two roles to this city. The political and oversight role of this council to ensure that money is spent appropriately and that we are constantly informed on the way in which that money is spent, and staff to do what they are told to do within the guidelines of the budget. And if you as council members don't want to know if a project comes over and then the cost overrun is $250,000 and you want to wait to the end of the year and you find out that there's been 7 projects for over $1 million that had cost overruns that we had no reporting structure for and that we had no authority to talk about, to ask questions about, to find out what the cost overruns are. Sometimes the cost overruns are out of staff hands, but sometimes the cost overruns relate to not accurately reflecting the proper circumstances of the situation. Sometimes the cost overruns may actually be partly the responsibility of the project manager in charge of this. Don't we want to know that? Don't we want to ensure that we can appropriately manage these budget items? This is, to me, very dangerous. And if we want to give staff all of this authority, then I would suggest just stop coming to council, because then our role is obsolete. We're literally handing over everything to staff to do, and we are giving up the power and authority that we have been elected to do, which was to watch the bottom line of the budget and the taxpayers' money.
Madam Treasurer, this is just a housekeeping. There would be no reason why this couldn't be referred back to the Finance Committee to work on.
Yes, this could be referred back to Finance for additional reporting back to Council.
Councilor Pidwerbecki?
Point of clarification. I'm of the understanding that we would be getting quarterly reports with regard to any of that, or am I wrong on that? I thought that was something that we normally would get anyway through the course of the...
Treasurer has made that comment twice during this debate.
Mr. Mayor, on a point of order, that's not what the comment was made. On a point of order, that was not the comment was made.
A point of order is done on a procedural issue, and that is not a procedural issue. Councillor Pidwerbecki,
Could I have
you
my
the floor.
question answered by the staff, please?
Yes, Madam Treasurer, please.
Through you, Mayor Henry, as previously mentioned on this item, staff currently report back to Council on the operating budget on a quarterly basis, and we talk about what variances there are, how we're tracking to budget. Currently, that report speaks really only to the operating budget. It does not speak to the capital budget, but what was suggested earlier is we could expand the scope of that report to outline any capital overages as well.
So presently, if I could, Mr. Mayor, presently, as we speak, we're saying we get a quarterly report, and again, I refer back to the last paragraph that was stated, so long as the adjustments are within the existing approved budget, and we get a quarterly report. Tell me that's not transparent. Tell me that's not keeping the council appraised of what's going on. Tell me that we are thrusting all of the decisions onto our staff. That is totally inaccurate. We are being informed. We are being told quarterly what's happening. And the staff is bound by staying within the approved budget. How much clearer can you be than that? And all we're doing is chasing ourselves to change a few little things that are already built into this. Why? Over half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, you're still coming out with the same verbiage that you're looking at on your screen. Whether you say, well, it's going to be 100,000 or it's going to be 250,000. You still are going to get a quarterly report, and it still must be within the budget. If not, you'll be hearing about it sooner. So we're just wasting a whole lot of time for why, that's my question, when it's all there. Thank you.
Councillor Chapman?
I'll make a motion to refer this back to the finance staff to come back up through the Finance Committee to Council I'm sure Ms. Sinnott will take into consideration all the comments that have been made here.
Referral, thank you. Okay, members of council understand where this is going. It's a referral back to finance. All those in favor?
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote. Called by Councilor McQuaid-England.
Councilor McQuaid-England.
Sorry, I got to stop. Councilor Bates? I'm sorry. I am going to call every person that's speaking to another member of council. So just so everybody, Councilor Carter, just so everybody's aware, when we start, the recorded vote has been called. We will proceed.
Could we repeat, what are we voting on?
Reporting on sending it back to the finance.
Councilor McQuaid-England.
No.
Councilor Neal.
No?
Councilor Pidwerbecki.
Yes.
Councilor Sanders.
Yes.
Councilor Shields.
Yes.
Councilor Aker.
Yes.
Councilor Bates.
Yes.
Councilor Carter.
Yes.
Councilor Chapman.
Yes.
Mayor Henry.
Yes,
Councilor Kerr.
Yes.
that carries.